For me, the intersection or between poetry and memoir, poetry and prose in general, first of all, I've written a lot of prose in terms of technical writing. As an engineer, about 70% of my job ended up being writing. And I think that translated also in my ability to write prose. I never had sort of an urgency to write prose of any kind. But after my third book of poetry, I realized there were still so many stories and so many anecdotes and so many characters and so many other things that I wanted to tell that somehow I knew instinctually that the poem couldn't contain. It's kind of hard to write a poem about easy cheese and get away with it. So I just basically started exploring writing prose, writing memoir, writing essay, just as a creative curiosity and intellectual curiosity, just to teach myself how to do something new, something related but new. And I was delighted because I suddenly, I could do all those things that I couldn't do in the poems. And for me, like the memoir of growing up in Miami is really just the first half of my first book of poetry. That's how compressed poetry is emotionally, how dense it is. But it's almost behind each poem there is all this backstory that really wasn't necessary in the poem, but makes for better prose. And so I was having a lot of fun with that. It was sort of like, I compare it to sort of playing the same song but in a different instrument. And so suddenly new things are possible. And I loved the initial sort of draft phases of writing prose. What I did not like about prose was the editing phases, or the really final editing phases, the copy editing phases, which I guess every poet has a little patience for. Things like the car was red in page 52, but it's maroon in page 152. Who cares? But you have to care when you write prose. And so those kind of tightening up of things were a little tiring for me, because in a poem there's so much, in a page you're looking at something so intensely and there isn't this sort of scanning of all these other elements. The poem is so focused on the raw elements of the emotion and the most minute moment that contains a universe. And so I didn't like that part of it, but I think how it's working for me is that I need to write poetry before I can write prose. And so poetry, in a way, creates the emotional outline, does the work of what essentially I want my prose to go towards. Rather than discovering it as much while writing the prose, I think it's a cycle for me. I think my next book needs to be poetry, and before it needs to be prose of any kind. So I think that's the way it's working. The poetry for me is informing the prose, not the other way around.